Hi, welcome. I'm Elaine Engelhardt from Utah Valley State, and I'm glad to have you here for our third class period of Ethics and Values. Today we're going to start the Judeo-Christian ethic, and we have several guests with us. First we have Dr. Brian Birch, and Dr. Birch is not only a good friend and colleague, but he's an associate professor of philosophy and the director of our religious studies program. And Brian's done a lot of work in putting that together. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you. And we have some great students here with us. We have Lloyd and John. And over here we have Luke and Aaron. So thanks for helping us out. And Brian, maybe you can tell us just a little bit about religious studies and why the Ten Commandments is such an important part of religious studies.
Well, religious studies in higher education is just the academic study of religion as a cultural phenomenon, is studying the various ways in which religion impacts the lives of people in terms of history and literature, theology, and other things. In terms of the Ten Commandments are important because they serve as a kind of historical foundation for a lot of subsequent thinking about morality and religion and the relationship between human beings and God in the tradition. So it's very important. It's a very good starting point, I think.
You know, when I started teaching this class back in 1986, I remember the first time that I brought the Bible into the classroom at a state college, and I felt a little uneasy about it. And then as the class period unfolded, I could see how this was not only viewed as religion, but as history, literature, and philosophy. And Luke, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how we can see the interdisciplinary nature of the Ten Commandments.
There are a few ways. The principles that are in the commandments can be seen as both a religious text for a believer and then also as just a code of ethics for anyone. It's also historical because it teaches us a lot about the culture of the ancient Hebrews if we understand the right context. So.
Very good. Anyone else want to add to this? Yeah. John?
The Bible has a strong tradition of influencing literature as well throughout Western society, and it has a strong influence on most literature because of that, because of its place in society. So.
Very good. Very good. And anything else you would like to add to that? So, Dr. Birch, we move on into looking at the Ten Commandments, and boy, there's a rich history right there with the Ten Commandments. And I must admit that I went to Egypt, la-di-da, a couple of years ago and got to go to Mount Sinai. Oh, nice. And they still have the burning bush there. And it's said that this species of plant won't grow anywhere else in the world, and they can't replicate it, but it continues to grow in this very desert country. And there are a lot of folks who like to come and visit the monastery that's right there next to Mount Sinai, and most people climb it at night, and it makes for quite an adventure. So once again, you love to look at the history. Can you tell us, though, a little bit about the history of the Ten Commandments? What was going on at this time?
Well, it's a familiar story to many of us. The ancient Hebrews had just been freed, according to the biblical narrative, from Egypt. They were wandering in the wilderness, and according to scholars, they arrived at Mount Sinai, and the Sinai events take place around the third month. After they had fled from Egypt. And as the story goes, Moses went up the mountain.
But they were running amok, weren't they?
Well, the story characterizes them as always needing guidance and help and restraint from God. And so by the time they reached Mount Sinai, they did need something like the Ten Commandments to anchor them.
Yeah, thanks. In fact, some people call them the children of Israel, Lloyd. Can you tell us a couple of contexts maybe for this term, the children of Israel?
Well, that term comes from because the Israelites, or the Hebrews, they originally came into Egypt back in the Bible story, back with Joseph, and as over time, the Egyptians began to enslave them and keep them captive. And the reason they called themselves the children of Israel is because they all claimed Israel as one of their ancestors.
Okay, very good. And Aaron, what if I told you that maybe they were called the children of Israel because they'd been slaves for so long that they were very childlike. They didn't really know how to behave as adults.
I don't know if that would be how I would characterize. I never thought of it that way, but I think that Moses in the biblical story does say that when he comes back from Mount Sinai that they are, like you said, running amok and are building golden calf, melting down gold, and are all kinds of things are happening, and Moses is just appalled by their behavior. So I think maybe we look at that as they do need that kind of guidance, that kind of self-control that we talked about in earlier episodes. And
very good, yes. And Luke or John, anything that you'd like to, boy, this sounds like we're in the New Testament already with Luke and John. So any comments you'd like to make on the historical context? I'm sure that Lloyd's got it right, but it's kind of interesting how long had they been in slavery? Do you remember?
A while. I think Lloyd's really the expert on this one. I don't want to try and add anything to that. So.
I'm not exactly sure about the years. It was for in the biblical narrative is for several hundred years, I believe.
Okay, very good. And so then, Brian, continue our story. So then Moses is going to, they're camped here at Mount Sinai. It's a hot place, I can tell you that.
Yes, the Lord bids Moses up the mountain, and as Aaron indicated, while Moses is away, the children of Israel engage in idolatry by worshiping the golden calf. An interesting fact is that the calf was the local god of that region, and so what them worshiping the golden calf means is that they were not being loyal to the God that brought them out of Egypt, but that they were being fickle and worshiping whatever God they happened to come across or whatever God they thought could help them in the circumstances. And it was just a short time after Moses had left that they had begun to turn to other gods. And so I think that's a good indication as to why the first couple of commandments have to do with fidelity to God. So.
Oh, thank you. And then Moses gets these very simple commandments for people that could be considered children, but really, Lloyd has it right. But are these commandments so simple, John?
I think in practice they're probably not. But ultimately, yeah, I mean, they're kind of straightforward. It's a very short section in the Bible that talks about the Ten Commandments, and it's just simple and straightforward. Moses comes back and he gives them to him, and I think initially, yeah, they seem fairly simple, but I think throughout history we've seen in practice they're not so simple.
Okay, thank you. You know, Brian and I were talking about this before class started, and people who are wanting to make sure that the Ten Commandments remain in public settings. The funny thing about it is if you ask some of these folks, where do you find it in the Bible? They can't tell you. This will be a test question. I'm going to ask you, where do you find the Ten Commandments in the Bible? And I just find that to be a very important thing. And also that you know the Ten Commandments. And as Brian was telling me, some of the folks knew 3 or 4, but they didn't know all of them. And you know, also, Brian, I like starting this class with the Ten Commandments because it's a very comfortable place for many of the students here. Sometimes if you say, well, what's your system of ethics? And they're stumbling a little bit, they're thinking about it, they can always rely on the Ten Commandments and say, well, I don't steal, I don't covet, well, hopefully they don't, yeah, and they can go through the list of 10 Commandments and say, these are all very important to me. So it's often something they can lean back on. What's another reason why you think it's important to familiarize our students and others with the Ten Commandments? Refresh it.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a place where they're comfortable talking about it, but historically, as John indicated, it has impacted the way in which we've thought about law, politics, economics, all kinds of social institutions began with the Jewish tradition. And also, you couple that with the Greco-Roman tradition and the way in which these two came together. I mean, these are the foundations of the way in which we think about all these social institutions. So I think both in terms of where the students are at and also historically, the Ten Commandments is a really good place to start. Yeah.
Very good. One of our oldest code of ethics. We've still got the Code of Hammurabi and other codes. But the Code of Ethics is, like you say, John, a very straightforward approach saying, here are 10 things that are expected of you. And this is also called a divine command theory. Let's pull up our first graphic. And Luke, would you read this for us, please?
Theory that commands we respect and follow God. We should obey because God commands us to.
Okay, so Brian, can you tell us a little bit more about divine command theory and how it fits into the tradition of ethics?
Well, most of what we're going to be studying throughout the semester has ethics based in some kind of rational principle. But the divine command ethics grounds our ethical obligation in God's commands.
Okay.
And so the reason why we should do something is because God commands it. So for example, it wouldn't make any sense to ask of God whether or not His commandment was the right commandment. It's the right commandment because God commands it. And so it's a different way of thinking about ethics, and it's going to be a nice contrast with the rest of the semester, I think, when we start talking about these other ethical systems, because it's grounded in a relationship with God, and rather than some kind of abstract principle.
Very good, and in fact, that's how the Ten Commandments starts out. And Luke, before we start pulling up the Ten Commandments, can you tell us a little bit about the Hebrew word for the Ten Commandments and what it means?
Yeah, the word is decalogue, and it means 10 statements or 10 commandments. And so
Okay.
it's just 10 statements.
All right. Anything you want to add to that, Lloyd, about that we just needed these 10?
One thing I think it's interesting what Dr. Birch was talking about is how the Ten Commandments is, in the divine command theory, it comes from a relationship with God for the people. And I like how you're talking about children earlier. And in a sense, there is kind of a parent-child relationship that's going on here. Because in the Ten Commandments, you don't just have God coming down and telling these people these things, but these commandments come after the children of Israel were freed from Egypt. And so, in a sense, in the story, God's telling them not just this is what you have to do, but look, I'm the one who's freed you here. I'm the one that's taken care of you. I'm the one that's brought you this far. And because of that, we have a relationship set up where you need to trust me here, and I'm going to give you instructions that'll help you continue on through your journey and whatnot.
Perfect. Thank you very much. In fact, John, let's go ahead and pull up the first commandment and have you read that for us.
Thou shalt have no other gods before me.
Okay, so this is pulling right in with what Lloyd was telling us then. And can you tell us a little bit about why he has to start with this one? Thou shalt have no other gods before me.
I think, like Dr. Birch was saying earlier, when Moses came back down from the mountain, the people were worshiping the local god, the calf, right? Mm-hmm. And so it does make sense that when Moses comes back down, that's the first thing he says, because that's the first thing that is said, because this is what's happening with the people, is that they are worshiping another god before the God that is commanding these things ultimately.
Okay. And Aaron?
Well, I think it's interesting that the very first commandment reminds the children of Israel of their relationship with God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. In other words, you need to have that first, and the 9 will follow. In other words, the relationship is required in order for the children to really take in the rest of the commandments.
Thank you. Very good. Anyone else want to add to that?
I wanted to add to
Birch?
something Lloyd said. He made a very good point. In the verse in Exodus, just before the first commandment, it says, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So it's already set up in a way that says, look, children of Israel, you have seen all the works I've done, all of the miracles that have happened to you to get you out. I've proven myself to you. now we can establish a relationship. So the foundation had already been set in previous actions for God to lay down these commands.
Very good. And in fact, it pulls us right into the second commandment, which is very much like the first commandment. And Luke, would you read the second one for us, please?
Mm-hmm. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything.
Okay, and Luke, why do you think that we need to kind of repeat this again?
I think there's something else here that's important. It goes a little beyond just other gods. There's something about, if you were to, you could apply this to lots of different things, but making something else more important than God, which could be an object, is something that was important. And then throughout the Old Testament, past this point, you see that this is an issue, a big issue with the house of Israel, partly because of the influence of other tribes, other Semitic groups in the area, that it really was something that they had a problem with.
Very good. And then we can go back also to the point that Dr. Birch made, that even when Moses had climbed Mount Sinai already, worshiping of the golden calf was going on. And so he has to remind them, not only, I'm your God, but number two, you can't have graven images. Let me get real specific about this. And so even though it's simple and straightforward, today we can still have graven images then, can't we, John?
Absolutely. I think that we see it a lot with things like television. We have a lot of people that, or entertainment in general. We see a lot of people that put a high price tag on this thing, and they value it a lot. So I think we do see a lot of this type of thing nowadays, so it's still applicable.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments on this one?
One thing that this commandment also helps us think about is the attraction to material objects and how it can pull us away from our relationship with other human beings and with God. And so there's a kind of abstractness to it, that God is not to be represented in any kind of graven image so as to create that kind of material attachment that had been the case with so many of the other religions in the area. And I think that's an important part of the Jewish tradition, is God is the invisible God, is the high God, rather than being pulled down in the form of some kind of material object.
Okay, very good. And once again, going back to Lloyd's point about the parent-child relationship, so to speak, as well. Okay. And let's pull the third one in, which once again we can say is a relationship with this God. And Aaron, would you read the third commandment for us?
Of course. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain.
Okay, very good. So once again, just saying, don't take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. And it's somewhat repetitive of the first two, but why do you think, Brian, that this needs to be set aside as a third command?
Well, it helps us think about the way in which we approach God, and that we shouldn't be flippant or take it less seriously than we do other things. That there's a very serious, reverential relationship that we have with God. Oftentimes, as a lot of us know in church, we hear this commandment as a prohibition against profanity, right? And that is a part of it. But there's also another dimension to it where invoking the name of God in a kind of casual way is also seen as a very, very serious sin, because as we see in the world today, the name of God is invoked for all kinds of things, some more serious than others, and sometimes it's done for vain purposes, for self-serving purposes. And I think this commandment has very important application to what's going on today in the way in which we discuss religion in our society.
Very good. In fact, maybe we could have Lloyd even expound on that just a little more, where taking the name of the Lord in vain may not just be swearing, that someone uses it in a sentence, but maybe it's used for a political cause. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that,
I
Lloyd?
mean, there's so many more ways than that this can be used. In some sense, there's that idea of oath making, where people are making promises in the name of God. By the name of God, I promise I'll do this. And if you don't fulfill that, then in a sense, you're taking the Lord's name in vain in this context. Another sense, in today's world, when people want to use God as a basis for hurting others or whatnot, that could also be considered taking God's name in vain, because you're applying something to God that you're really just doing in yourself, for yourself.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to add to this one?
I think that part of the point is to not distract from the sacred nature of God and the relationship with God. And so all these other things that we're talking about are just are distractions.
Very good. And not appropriating the name of God,
Exactly.
particularly in vain. Okay. And let's go ahead and pull up the next commandment. And once again, we're still seeing that this God is expecting a lot of respect, not only from these children of Israel, but for those who still say, this is my God and I obey this commandment. So do you want to read this one for us, John, please?
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy.
Okay, and so Luke, why is this command there? Why is, we're following these commands before we even get into thou shalt not kill. Why do you think we have these foundational commandments?
I think this one is extremely important for a number of reasons. In the historical context, for one, there were often, having a Sabbath day is a symbol of the creation. There was a period when God rested from that. It's also used in various other forms, excuse me, in the law, in the commandments that they receive, in that, they were supposed to take a rest every seventh year and take a Sabbath of an entire year. And part of it was just that they were a lot of the same sort of thing, that they were supposed to trust that God was going to provide for them. They were supposed to really, trust that He would provide for them and not work, and it would be very difficult to do it for an entire year, especially.
Thank you. In fact, do you know that continues on into the educational system, and sabbatical comes from that very same concept, where faculty will take a year off to do some expert study rather than be in the classroom teaching. So there, in a lot of contexts, it's still used. Dr. Birch, anything you would like to add to this Sabbath day?
Well, this command, as Luke had mentioned, is important because it sets the cycle of time up. And so in Genesis, of course, we read about the creation, as Luke mentioned, 6 days of work, a seventh day of rest, and setting it up in this way created a pattern for the Israelites to follow. And it's a pattern, as we know, that has been followed ever since in the Western tradition, right? Where the whole concept of the Sabbath, the whole weekend is built around the Sabbath cycle. So it has had a lot of influence on just the way in which we think about time. But it also has application to the idea of the relationship between work and rest, and how much work in relationship to how much rest we see as being appropriate. And so it really orients us in ways that we might not have thought of before in just how we behave, in society.
Okay, outstanding. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, John.
I was also going to say it's interesting to note that these people were just freed from slavery, where they were probably worked 7 days a week all the time. And so it's kind of interesting that one of the commandments is, hey, you get a day of rest now. You get a rest, and so I think it's kind of interesting. So it's almost well-deserved.
So it's a day of rest, but also keep it holy. Remember me on this day. Yeah, very good, John. Anyone else have a thought on that? Well, let's move on to the fifth one. Sometimes this is known as a family command. And once again, God reminding us that we need to have some respect for our folks. And Aaron, do you want to read this one for us, please?
Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee.
Okay, thank you. And so, Luke, how does this follow back to this parent-child relationship?
You mean Lloyd?
Lloyd, I'm sorry. I'm looking at Lloyd and calling him Luke, sorry.
It's all right. I think there's several things that's interesting with this one. A lot of times, my parents used to invoke this, when I was when they thought I wasn't being as obedient to them as I should have been. But one of the big aspects of this, and I think with a lot of these commandments, is the sense that they're traveling through the wilderness right now. Just like every 7 days they needed rest. With this one, when they're traveling through the wilderness, some of your biggest burdens are going to be the elderly who are slow, you might have to carry, who can't walk themselves. And it'd just be easy to toss them aside or to leave them behind. And in this commandment, he's saying, look, you can't leave behind your father and your mother. You can't leave behind the elderly. You have to take care of them. And the promise goes on that your days can be long as well. And so, he's saying, look, God's telling him, look, you have to take care of the elderly. You just can't leave them behind. You have to bring them with you, and then you'll receive that same blessing as well.
And yes, what goes around comes around. So that one day you too could be in this situation. Other takes on this, Erin?
I actually think it's an interesting move. The first 4 commandments seem to be about our personal relationship with God. And then we move into this commandment, which is about a relationship with our family, like you referenced. Mm-hmm. And as we see, we'll move out into, I think, more of a community kind of concept in some of the rest of the commandments. And so it's not just 10 commandments that are just straightforward, but they're straightforward for all of the relationships that the house of Israel would participate in.
Thank you. And in fact, Dr. Birch, I've seen the commandments broken down in several ways, and maybe you could explain this, but one way has been that the first 4 commands are God's commands to humans, and that the 5th commandment is the family commandment, and then the next 5 are humans' commands to one another. But you've seen other breakdowns as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how different traditions actually identify different commandments as being the first or the second or the third or the 9th or the 10th. Uh-huh. So it's even gotten to that point. But that's a common one. Another common one is the more simple breakdown between the so-called religious commands, which are the relationship between God and humans, and the social or moral commands, which are commands in relationship to each other, whether it be in the family or to broader society. It might be a good thing at this point to note that this is a tribal ethic. Mm-hmm. And so the application of the ethic is among the group of people. And in Jewish tradition, these commands are only binding upon the children of Israel. They're not binding upon those who are not part of the covenant or of the group. They have a different set of commands that are said to have been given after the flood with Noah. And so oftentimes we think about the 10 Commandments as being universally applicable, when in actuality they're a tribal ethic and they have very set social patterns. And so when we talk about the broader commandments that are coming up, they're really to the tribe and don't necessarily apply outside of it. So something to note.
It is something to note. And in fact, let's go ahead and look at these tribal ethics, so to speak, and how we are expected, if we believe in this God, to treat one another.
Let me add something else, if I may.
Please.
By seeing the order of commandments, we see that we move from the relationship to God to the family relationship, as you reference, and it kind of sets an order of importance now, where the family relationship becomes very important mm-hmm. in the tribe. And again, I think historically that's been a very important thing for us, because the kind of family relationship that we see as being so important now in the Western tradition was not the case historically, and isn't the case in many other cultures, where the family isn't necessarily the fundamental unit of society. Other ways of relating to each other have been part of other cultures. So I think that the family ethic is very important. It's very important to call our attention to it as we look at how the commandments have influenced us.
Thank you. Any questions for Dr. Birch on this? Any comments? Very good.
Thanks.
I liked how that ties in then to maybe the ordering of our next 5 commandments. And some people say that this is an exact order, because with the 6th commandment, let's go ahead and pull it up. And Lloyd, would you read that for us?
Thou shalt not kill.
Okay, very good. And he just comes right out and says, thou shalt not kill. And of course, we know that Jewish scholars can spend an entire semester studying this one commandment. Why is it so complicated, Lloyd?
Well, because everyone, even today, most people say, okay, yeah, you obviously shouldn't kill someone. But then questions come, well, what if instances of self-defense? What about capital punishment? What about acts of war? What about all these other situations? And once you start going into there, it becomes a lot more complicated, because in an instance of self-defense, the idea comes, well, if I don't kill this person, they might kill me. So am I allowing myself to be killed? And that raises questions of what about suicide and all those other things. So while it might seem simple to not, this command to not kill, it's really deep and has a lot of it's really complex.
Thank you. And Luke, it doesn't say, thou shalt not kill in cold blood. It says, thou shalt not kill. So how can that be confusing to you, is it?
It can be, and I think that may be part of the reason why these are for the Hebrews and for modern day Jews. These are just 10 of many commandments in the Old Testament. There are hundreds of commandments, and many of them link to these. You can kind of group all of the other commandments along the lines of these 10, so that the other commandments deal with more specific cases. And that's kind of what they had to do as different, you might say, as different situations come up with these rules for more specific instances.
Okay, thanks. Any enlightenment on this for us, Brian?
That's a very good point.
It is.
In Jewish tradition, there are 613 commandments, and according to some traditions in Judaism, the 10 commandments are really just categories of commandments within which these other more specific commandments fall. So you have the 10 commandments, which help us categorize the others, 613 commandments, and then you have centuries of commentary on these other commandments, and then commentary on the commentary. And so you have a long tradition of ways of thinking about and interpreting a seemingly very, very simple commandment. And Lloyd brought up some of the complicating factors in trying to understand how this is applied in practice. I mean, it's very simple. It's a very simple point that, in Exodus we have God commanding the Hebrews not to kill, but in the book of Joshua we have the Lord commanding them to do precisely that, to kill others outside the tribe again. And so it raises questions about the scope of the application of the commandment and other things. So it is interesting and complicated.
And in many of our favorite Bible stories, we'll even find where God is commanding that others be killed. And whether this is a story of Saul, and Saul being told who to kill and who not to kill, and what ways he should take, or, as you mentioned, other areas of the Bible. And so it does get very complicated. And the Talmud is something that often many of us in this community don't pick up and study, but would be very valuable in studying the 10 Commandments for a Jewish individual then.
Right. One way of interpreting or understanding the commandment to not kill is thou shalt not take innocent human life. That's been one way of understanding it. And so it brings in the concept of innocence versus guilt, which informs, the debate about capital punishment and the possibility of it, because we see capital punishment being applied in ancient Israel.
Thank you. And Aaron, what do you think are some other issues in this ethics class that deal with thou shalt not kill?
Well, I think it's interesting that this isn't a prescription that's limited to just the 10 Commandments. We see in other cultures and in other ancient groups that killing is something that's usually on the top of the list. One shouldn't do that. And I think as we study ethics, we'll look and see that we're going to find philosophers who are willing to say that we shouldn't kill, but from a rational justification rather than a divine command theory. But that it doesn't really change. No one's out there saying we should all just go out and kill whoever we want to kill.
Right, and often when we've had those divine commands to kill, it has been someone outside of the tribe, whether it's with the Judeo-Christian tradition or another religious tradition. It's often that it's allowed for self-preservation and other things.
Right.
Luke, can you tell me a little bit more about this commandment and its application to the class? Some issues such as war and nuclear war, euthanasia. Go ahead.
I think a lot of the topics that we're going to be talking about are just going to demonstrate how very complex this is and how difficult it would be, you know, if we were to carry on sort of the tradition of coming up with situations when it was okay and when it was not okay, how much larger the Old Testament would have to be, because there's so many complicated issues that, especially today in the 21st century, it's not easy to draw the line. There's a lot of gray, just like there was then, but it's increasing.
And that's also why we have these discussions in rational justification, saying, well, this was automobile homicide, and let's give the case for this and what the punishment would be for something that was an accident, or maybe something that had fault in the accident, such as driving under the influence or something. So we still know thou shalt not kill, but there may be some gradations here and there even.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Dr. Birch, so we've got these 10 commandments, and now that we're down to these last 5, is there a hierarchy? Is thou shalt not kill more important than any of the others? I mean, even any of these other, how many did you say, 680?
613.
Oh, sorry, I added a few.
Well, actually, no. In Jewish tradition, all of the commandments are said to be equal because they come from God. And so to try to create a hierarchy is kind of irreligious in a way. Mm-hmm. And so it's commonly held that the 10 Commandments are somehow more important or should be more closely obeyed than the other ones, but that's simply not true. And some of these other commandments that we read about in Exodus and Leviticus are very, very specific. And so it could be the case that thou shalt not kill is equally important as the way in which one prepares food. Mm-hmm. And the kind of food one has with regard to the kosher laws. So,
very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, let's move on then to the 7th commandment. And would you go ahead and read this for us then, Erin?
Sure. Thou shalt not commit adultery.
Thank you. And in the past, sometimes in my classes, the students will say that maybe we don't need this commandment anymore, that it was only necessary for birth control and keeping track of lineages, that we needed to make sure that we knew what the lineage was, and so it wasn't good to have sex outside of marriage. But now that there's birth control, then you don't have to worry about that anymore. Is this still an important command, Dr. Birch?
well, I mean, for many people in society that have a religious ethic, it's very important because it's tied back to this idea of the integrity of the family. Mm-hmm. And the family ethic. And we hear a lot of talk in society about how important the family is, and the importance of fidelity in marriage and rearing children and all of that. And I think that this is something that can be referred to by those who are very interested in maintaining the integrity of the family, because there is a kind of family ethic to the 10 Commandments. Now, some have exploited it and utilized it in different ways, but I think it's there and something that needs to be discussed. So, it's a very important commandment and taken very seriously, as we see in the ethical debates of our day.
So my students are going to lose out on that argument, aren't they, Luke? Can you tell me how it's a strong ethic in terms of harming others, that who is harmed by breaking this command?
I think along the lines of what Dr. Birch was saying, there's a lot of evidence for the fact that that sort of the traditional family, having a family structure is extremely beneficial for children. And there are all kinds of sociological evidence about if you have sort of that structure, then children are more likely to excel in education and less likely to wind up in prison and so forth. And so it could definitely be argued that the harm is to the individual children if it's not obeyed, and then society as a whole, because if it's true, then you would be increasing the number of criminals and decreasing the number of people who excel.
Okay, very good. And I guess, Lloyd, it also comes back down to this God said you do it.
Yeah, it comes down to that. And also, I think it's interesting if you watched television at all. I mean, almost every television show, one way or another, comes down to this commandment in a lot of senses. I mean, fights. You watch daytime talk shows. I mean, everyone's fighting over because because of infidelity. You watch, TV shows at night, sitcoms, whatever. There's always this trouble, always people being hurt. You watch the news, there's people killing each other because a spouse hasn't been loyal. And so, in a lot of sense, this is pointing back and trying to maintain a society where people can get along and work together. And especially as they're traveling through, as these Israelites are traveling through the desert, through the wilderness, they need that kind of stability. If everyone starts hopping around and whatnot, then it'll ruin that unity that they needed to survive.
Very good, very important in the tribal unity. Thank you. Well, let's go ahead and move on then to the next commandment. And John, would you read this one for us?
Thou shalt not steal.
Okay, John, tell me a little bit how complicated this one is.
Well, if you're starving and you need a loaf of bread, then is it justifiable to steal? I mean, there are a bunch of complications like that where, I mean, if it's a matter of survival, is it really against God's wishes for you to survive and to take a loaf of bread? I mean, there's just very basic problems like that throw this whole commandment into oblivion.
Okay. How about you, Luke? Any thoughts? And then Aaron, I'll get your comment.
Yeah, I think once again, changes in society have made this much more complicated. We can patent drugs now that are life-saving, and the person who holds that patent owns the right to create it. And yet there are people who can't afford the drug, such as in sub-Saharan Africa with the AIDS epidemic. For them, they can't afford the price that the drug company is going to charge. And so for somebody to produce the same drug without paying the patent royalties, would that be stealing? They're saving hundreds, maybe millions of lives if they did it.
Okay, good dilemma. Aaron?
Well, I just think it's interesting, and I don't want to sound so hardline, but, nowhere in the Ten Commandments does it say thou shalt not be killed. Thou shalt not die. And I think it's interesting that maybe the worst thing that can happen to us is a death, according to God. And so thou shalt not steal, if we wanted to take it very literally, could mean thou shalt not even steal the loaf of bread. I think as human beings, that's just difficult to wrestle with. Thou shalt not kill, and that means even in self-defense. These are things I think everyone would really struggle with, that idea. But there are those who want to take the Bible that literally. And if we take it, do we have to take it literally from start to finish if we choose to take one, or do we take the whole thing figuratively? I know that Brian discusses that in his religious studies class, but that's, I think, something that I don't know if we can answer.
Aaron, I have this favorite Dilbert cartoon, and Dogbert is the ethics advisor, and he says, if our products are killing people, and we know they are, then is it okay for me to steal office supplies? And he says, I'd have to say yes. But Dr. Birch, what would you like to add on?
Well, these are all very good comments, and it raises something that is part of ethical thinking, and that's the idea of conflicting ethical commands. And that's been alluded to here, because there might be a conflict between the command to steal and the command to kill, or at least allow to die. And that's a distinction that you might raise later when we talk about euthanasia. So if the result of not stealing the loaf of bread is someone dying, would that be a violation of the commandment, thou shalt not kill? Does letting die mean the same thing as killing? So all of these things are things that need to be worked out, and have been worked out in various ways in the Jewish tradition as they comment upon the law. So
thanks. And things get more complicated for us too, Brian, in these areas. now we say, is it stealing when I download this music?
Right.
Is it stealing when I borrow this program from my friend? You know, where do the stealing lines come in when it comes to new technologies?
Yeah, it raises questions about what constitutes a possession. Because if you're stealing something, presumably you're stealing it from someone else, right? Which somehow they have rights to, and it raises questions about, well, is intellectual property property in the same way that my watch is a piece of property? And you know, obviously these things weren't dealt with in the ancient world, but if one takes seriously these commands, you need to have some concept of what property means and how it's defined and the proper relationship between others in terms of distributing property.
Sure, you know, in fact, I know you were our department chair for the last 5 years, and an exceptional department chair at that. And probably one of the problems you dealt with most would be plagiarism, where students would steal sources.
Right.
Or maybe even a faculty member might steal source and not give proper attribution. And certainly this wouldn't have been a problem in Moses' time.
Right. Yep, that's true. And one of the interesting aspects of this plagiarism phenomenon is that depending on what culture the student comes from or what background they come from, they might come from a culture where borrowing another's idea or incorporating another's idea into one's own is not seen as a problem at all. And so in that case, is it stealing? If there are a set of cultural norms that don't make it wrong, should they be held to the same kinds of standards? Should they be expected to be aware of it? All these things are on the table.
Oh, yeah,
So.
it gets very complicated. Thank you. Well,
So the seemingly simple commandments, you know, as we've seen from our discussion, raise all kinds of complicating questions that we have a whole semester to work out, I suppose.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Well, and this 9th commandment is really a big commandment as well. And Lloyd, do you mind reading this for us and telling us a little bit about what bearing false witness means?
Sure. It says, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor."
Okay, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, a lot of times people just want to break this down to lying, but I think, from what I understand, in this time period with the Israelites, bearing false witness, a lot of it had to do with when you're making an accusation against someone else. It's like almost like being a witness in a court case or something, and claiming that someone else did something, like claiming someone else killed or claiming someone else broke one of these other commandments, when in fact that didn't occur.
Okay, thank you. In fact, one of my favorite urban legends that goes along with this commandment is a man who found out he'd been bearing false witness against his neighbor. And he went to his neighbor and said, "I'm sorry, I found out that I have been spreading something about you that is untrue, and I'd like you to forgive me." And the man said, "Okay, but I'd like you to take these feathers and spread them all around town and then come back to me." So the guy said, "Thanks, I'd be glad to do that." And he spread the feathers all around town, came back to his neighbor, and the neighbor said, "Okay, now go pick them all up again." And so you can see why C.S. Lewis, the great theologian, said that he felt like this was almost on par with killing someone, that you kill their reputation and you can't take back all those feathers. Do you want to comment a little bit also on bearing false witness in the workplace or the neighborhood or other aspects?
Well, there are
Brian?
all kinds of possible implications for this commandment, not only in a court of law, but just in other kinds of social circumstances, whether it be, you know, economic transactions, political transactions, or personal transactions. You know, I mean, this can be applied to, you know, from anything to perjury in a court of law to gossip around the water cooler about a fellow person in order to aggrandize oneself, for example. So there are all kinds of applications, and it's something that we continue to wrestle with as human beings in the way in which we deal with each other. Is, you know, we want honor and we want something for ourselves, and we're willing to impugn the honor of someone else, if you want to put it in honor terms. And this is a very straightforward command that wants to do away with that.
Okay, and Aaron, maybe it's the easiest command to break. I mean, all you have to do is open your mouth. You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Well, I think what's interesting about this commandment is how relevant it still is, and really all of them are, and how if C.S. Lewis says, it's right up there with, thou shalt not kill. I don't know if I agree with the hierarchy of it, but I do think, like you said, it's certainly easier to break than thou shalt not kill. I'm certainly going to be aware if I've stabbed someone, but I may not be aware if I've, by saying one to me harmless thing to my girlfriend, whisper, whisper, that I've really hurt someone in some other way, and I don't know who else's ears that will get to, and in an awful game of telephone kind of idea.
Mm-hmm. Luke, some thoughts for us on this one, and how sometimes these harms don't ever go away. When someone bears false witness against you, you still remember those things because you don't get your day in court. You don't get your headline saying, that was a vicious lie.
Yeah, it's true. I think what you said was very interesting about killing somebody's reputation, which is something that is extremely important in America, where a lot of social mobility is based on our social capital, how much the level of trust others feel with us. And if somebody goes and smears rumors, it could very easily destroy your career.
Okay, very good. And it just sometimes seems to be the stock in trade in some areas, that's how you get the promotion, by spreading vicious rumors about someone else. And I guess they call it swimming with the sharks, and that sometimes folks will do anything, and a big part is ruining a reputation. And John, something that you can add to this commandment, thou shalt not bear false witness.
I just want to reinforce that I like the distinction of this being part of how we're supposed to treat each other. And I think this is also a really important part, and it is, like Aaron said, something that you really have to be aware of almost at all times, because you're right, all you have to do is open your mouth.
Okay, very good. Well, let's move on to our last commandment. And Aaron, would you read this one for us, please?
Thou shalt not covet.
Okay, Dr. Birch, can you tell us, what does this mean, thou shalt not covet?
Well, coveting is, one way of thinking about it, is desiring something else to the point where it somehow overcomes you and impacts the way in which you behave because you are so desirous to have something, whether it be, a material possession or a member of the opposite sex or something. And it lists in the Bible, specific things that we shouldn't covet, but of course it can be applied to all kinds of things.
Okay, and Aaron, when you think of not coveting, where does it tie in for you?
Well, I think I see it in a number of different ways. Material possessions are one. Again, as Brian said, relationships and lust and those kinds of ideas. But I think most of all, it's that kind of tunnel vision that you get, and it distracts you from your relationship with your family, with God, with the tribe, or the community who's also following the laws, or everyone. And you don't even have to open your mouth for this one.
Okay. Yeah.
I think an important point to add, to highlight what Aaron said about not opening one's mouth, is the last two commandments have to do with one's own inner self, one's own thoughts. And that's an important contribution to the way in which human beings have thought about ethics, because before this, you couldn't have imagined an ethical system or behavior system being based upon just one's own thoughts and one's wrestlings with one's own feelings and emotions. But here we have it right there. Very, very important contribution to human ethical deliberation. So.
Thank you. In fact, our last class period opened up with saying that ethics has to do with having self-control, that we're all very self-interested. There are things that we want to do, and that we have to restrain these, that we can't go out and do everything that we would like to do, and that we really do have to do self-reflection. We have to say, how will this harm others? And so those last two commandments help us to really pull that into perspective.
Yeah. I need to make a qualification when I say the last 2 commandments. Again, they're divided up differently, where some traditions actually divide "thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife" as a separate commandment from the other objects of coveting. And so I found that very interesting as well.
It is, yeah. So, and it pulls right back with the adultery commandment. So I suppose when you start coveting, it leads you down the road to being able to break any of these commandments. So Luke, anything you'd like to add to "thou shalt not covet"?
I just think it's interesting to see that a lot of the others are very specific, and like Dr. Birch said, this one does list certain specific things that you should not covet. But this one is, at least in my mind, a bit more open-ended than some of the others, where it doesn't try to list quite so many specifics and kind of lets us go, okay, we could covet a lot of things. So.
Okay, thank you. I've really enjoyed our discussion that we've had on the 10 Commandments. And once again, I'll just ask Lloyd and John to reiterate for us, why is it important that we have this as part of our discussion on ethics, Lloyd?
I think it's important, one, because as we've mentioned before, the 10 Commandments and this Judeo-Christian ethics and whatnot are really foundational to a lot of the ethics that we have, not just in America, but in a lot of the Western world. And so understanding these, because these are foundational for a lot of the ways we think now, understanding these helps us understand the way we think today.
Okay, and a quick comment, John.
Yeah, they are hugely influential on Western tradition. They have been for thousands of years. So they are just very, very important.
Thank you. Brian, I am so glad that you could be here in our class period today. You have added so much enlightenment, and these students are absolutely brilliant, aren't they?
Yes, it's been my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting
Oh,
me.
thank you. And we're going to move on into Sermon on the Mount for our next class period, and Dennis Potter will be here for that one. But I'm sure that you would also have so much to contribute to that.
Sounds like a fun discussion.
Will be. Well, thank you, and thanks to all of you. And if now you would open your Bibles to the New Testament and look at Sermon on the Mount, and a test question could be, where do you find it?